Joining me now to discuss the measures by the federal government to ease, food inflation. I'm joined now by my guest, who is Rabiu Hassan. He is an economic analyst. Thank you again for joining us on Business Daily.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you for joining. I'd like for you to, start off by appraising the effort of the government so far, especially in the area of inflation and food inflation specifically. And what is your opinion on this news, even though we do understand that there has been, diverse opinions after the news had broke out? We did see a debunking come from the federal government. But what are your thoughts on all of these measures?
Good morning, our listeners. I think what we have seen is the usual cosmetic gestures of the government and trying to address a fundamental thing, fundamental factors that actually have bedeviled our economy in ages by just applying some paracetamol type of intervention. I mean, where the pain is deeply rooted, and then cosmetic interventions like this one being heard, and so many of the things that were said for purpose of creating impressions is what we always see. Of course, politicians and public office holders believe and understand that one best way to explain your inabilities is to keep churning out promises and keep the Nigerian masses believing that something is being done. And while we now half of the year had gone, coming from where we were by May 20s, how do I call it? That is from the change of administration from the previous to this one.
May 29th.
May 29th, sorry. And we're still moving around on a roller coaster, moving around the same space, and basically we have not seen so far every of the initiatives of the governments that have been put in place to address the issue of inflation working. Working in the sense that we have not seen the prices, especially of food, stabilizing, and talk less of even being reverting back to some points that would be reasonable enough for an average Nigerian to afford to have decent meals, So it's just one of those things and one of those gestures, not actually actions that I take as fundamentally having potentials to actually create those, shifts that we need in the way the economy is managed, so that Nigeria would register some semblance of stability and probably assume some semblance of growth.
Well, interesting review right there by my guest, Rabiu Hassan, based on the efforts that we have seen so far by the federal government towards easing inflation and food inflation specifically. Well, there is still much more to come. To stay, the conversation continues after the break. And you're still watching Business Daily, coming to you live on Trust TV. And just before the break, we started a conversation on the effort by the federal government so far towards easing inflation. And one of those is the alleged proposed suspension of import duties on specified items. And we have started a conversation, and my guest is still with me, Rabiu Hassan. Thank you again for coming on Business Daily.
Thank you very much.
But let us hear, from you. Peradventure this, pulls through. What effects is this expected to have? Because just like one of our commenters, raised, we have seen this happen in the past, and it did have some, advantages at the time. So what would be, the short-term benefit if this really does happen?
Good. I think the last question is speaking about short-term benefit, and I'm looking at if we assume the statement or the intention of the government is true and real, and that the government really have carefully planned what it needs to do to get to provide those fiscal incentives. I mean, like the waiver of import duties on some of these things that are needed. And of course, getting to allow those that will do the import, because ultimately the government, the policy statement is not suggesting whether government will directly import or whether it will allow individuals and businesses to do the import. Now, to get to import sufficient amount, that is where the fiscal incentive is already in place, if we assume. To get to import these products and then get the products across our bad and dilapidated infrastructure and distribute the food given our very inefficient network of routes, and given the cost of energy, that is the cost of fuel, cost of electricity that it will take to get these products to the various ponds and various markets that Nigerians will finally find it accessible. If you do the math, you will see that that will not achieve the objective. Because by the time you import cheap food, and let's say from Lagos upwards into the hinterland, by the time you now begin to add all those cost factors, because the prices you see in the market aggregates every cost information down from the point of production to the point of consumption. Now, there's basically, you will not basically see any real tangible reduction in the price, except, of course, if, of course, on situations where government have reserves, that one can work because the reserves are spread across the country. But where the reserves are not there, I know that there's nothing like that, because government can always say there is, but in real terms, we've not seen the actual reserve that was said to have been available work in addressing the inflation challenges that we have been seeing lately. So plus minus, it's no longer going when you're talking about food supplies, talking about food security. 6 months is not short term. 6 months is not short term. When you talk of short term in a case like this, you should begin to see things, trickling down to the markets in the next 2 months. If not, I don't think it will work again.
But I'm very curious, because you are someone who, you're a key player in the agri space here in Nigeria. And I remember just about a year ago, at about this same time last year, when, the president, eventually became or sworn into office, he had decreed a state of emergency on food security. And almost 1 year down the line, not so much has really changed in that regard. And you have, made for some very salient point, especially with the infrastructure, the dilapidated infrastructure that Nigeria currently has. But what would you say are low-hanging fruit solutions to this problem? I ask this because we've seen quite a number of policies and efforts which unfortunately haven't yielded the perceived or the expected outcome. So what would you suggest?
Now, like I said, and I have continued to say, the problem with food security, let's call it, is the fact that some of the fundamentals are not appropriately been done. Some of the fundamental things that needs to be done. Like I said, the food value chain, the agriculture value chain, starting from the lower value chain upwards, where you find the government's specific policy focus is on the food production itself, as against what makes food production efficient and what makes food produced, the distribution of produced food efficient. You will always find that the integration would always be weak, in the sense that you'll be doing one good thing here, but because you're not doing that appropriate thing there, it makes a mess of what you have actually achieved. And I think that is why we always see the fundamentals that needs to be done to get Nigeria takes care of issues, the threats of food security, should be a very holistic approach. We should talk about what does it take to get the agric inputs into the agricultural process. Now, what does it take after the production to markets, efficient storage, and what have you? Don't forget, despite all this state of emergency that we're talking about, we've not seen anything being done on the side of, for example, taking care of the about 30% of food wastage that we see, we register annually as far as wastage is concerned, because we cannot store we don't have sufficient infrastructure and efficient infrastructure to store the excess. So about 30% of every 100 bags of produce we produce is wasted, post-harvest loss. And so where you are trying to address the agriculture sector and you don't address the matter, in fact, if the government could concentrate and address the issue of post-harvest loss, beginning from the end of this rainy season, we would see probably an addition of another 15% of what produced back into the economy, because it is not wasted. So there are so many things in the value chain that need to be fixed and that have to work appropriately in harmony for us to have an efficient agricultural industry that will serve the strategic needs of the nation. Besides, from the declaration of the total war against food insecurity and what have you, Nigeria had succeeded in adding the number of hungry people in the world from 89.4 million people to 104 million people in just 1 year, courtesy of food inflation, which resulted from government inactions, fiscal policy inactions, fiscal policies that actually set the government back in billions and billions of dollars. And you can see how it works. If you decide you have an objective and then you go on the other side and take decisions that would actually negative the entire effect of what you have achieved in the other side, it tells you there's some problem with the orchestra. What I mean by the orchestra is that, of course, our lead orchestra should be the president of the country, because every actor, as far as the economic management, as far as policy management, as far as delivering, taking this country to where we want, is operating under the purview of the lead conductor. And unfortunately, we're not seeing that harmony that is expected in the National Economic Orchestra that could be able to give us the kind of impetus we would see to make Nigerians safer as far as food security is concerned.
Well, like you say, the numbers never really lie, and time is ticking. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization, about 31 million Nigerians may face severe food shortages by August this year. What crosses your mind when you hear, such numbers? Already you had reeled out quite a number of, data showing just what had happened in the space of 1 year. And now in August, we're talking barely 2 months from now. When you hear, numbers such as that, what crosses your mind?
Now, what crosses my mind is that percentages like this within the context of Nigeria represents a very, very significant number as far as the African continent is concerned. And let me come to probably dimension it in such a way that our viewers could understand more easily. When you say 31 million people are facing the risk of hunger or even starvation, you're saying that about 3, 4, 5 countries of Africa, the population of about 3 or 4 or 5 different countries in Africa are going to face starvation, kind of food insecurity. I mean, you imagine what kind of a dimension of a crisis you are looking at. Now, in the entire African continent, with the 54 nations that we have, I want to tell you that I believe probably you might not find 7 or 8 countries that have a population of 31 million people. But because of Nigeria's endowment, 31 million people out of 200 million people represents almost 15% or thereabout of the total Nigerian population. And we're in a nation and a country that has every natural endowment that is needed to get food available, sufficiently available, affordable. But yet we don't have people that can put all these factors of production together and get us the right amount, the right quality, at the right price for Nigerians to consume. I think that is the kind of dimension one will put the whole thing to. 31 million people, there are no up to 6 countries in Africa that have up to 31 million people as far as their population. And you can imagine that same population is subjected to this kind of risk of food insecurity. I think it's something that should speak to our politicians. But anyway, like we always say, they will always find some reasons to explain why they have failed. You know, when you talk of the energy that this entire Senate of the Federal Republic is dissipating in debating about the change in the national identity or in the national anthem, or the energy dissipated in the cause of making a law, the anti-grazing national law, kind of, and then no energy is dissipated on discussing these fundamental issues. I mean, it tells you that representation that we all have been trained to believe, to think we are. I think they are representing some other interests apart from the interests of Nigerians.
Okay, I'd like for us to speak towards, policy direction or policy shift. You've touched on what we have seen so far come from our policy makers, and like you rightly pointed out, it's almost as though there is disconnect with the realities the Nigerians are really facing. What should we be seeing? What should be coming from our policymakers at this point? Different from what we have experienced or has been our current realities. Speaking about policy making and policy direction.
So I think when you say policy making is supposed to be a process. Policy implementation is supposed to be another process. So where the two processes don't speak to each other. What I mean by at the point of the policy initiation and policy development and approval, the agency of government or those set of people in government that are supposed to implement have basically no deep understanding of the intentions of the policy, or at the same time not been motivated enough to understand and implement the policies. You always find that policies are always documented, packaged and then kept in the archives. And when it comes to the implementation, you find that it is not, the result, the final outcome that you're supposed to see, which the policy document has specified, has always not been achieved. And that is what we have registered, what we have seen over a very long period of time. Now, when the president comes and says he has declared a state of emergency in the agriculture sector, you would anticipate possibly that everybody involved in the process should equally declare his set of war theater to achieve the objective of the president. But unfortunately, immediately after the pronouncement, everybody goes back to business and it as usual. The legislative arm of the government that is supposed to check and ensure that things are done in a democracy don't basically do that. They mostly dissipate their political and kinetic energy in some of the frivolities, that comes with the office of being Mr. A or Mr. B. While whether those policies of government have achieved, it's not the business of the day. And that is why you will see that our budgets, if you see our budget cycles, it's always like a melodramatic kind of an annual jamboree. The public servants and then politicians undertake, and then after the approvals of the budget, everybody goes back home and take the little bits that he has provided in his constituency project and then implement. And that the government that is supposed to do the implementation actually doesn't care whether the fundamental economic objective of those provisions of the budget are achieved or not. That's why the economy is not growing. That's why hunger is increasing. That is why illiteracy is increasing. And that is why Nigeria has a population of children not going to school, a population the size of some of the biggest countries in Africa. And that is normal. And the governors are easily on a kind of a jamboree on what they do in construction of bridges and what have you, instead of construction of waterways and then creation of infrastructure that will impact on the economy. They are addressing the cosmetics of their urban centers and what have you. And you see the quantum of resources that is being put into the cosmetics, kind of, and vis-a-vis the quantum of resources and energy put in those fundamental things that needs to be done to get food on the table, affordable. I think nobody is doing that. Nobody is doing that.
What are these fundamental things?
Now, when I say fundamentals, is that now the biggest threat Nigeria is facing as we speak is threats of climate change. In fact, the insecurity that has ensued in Nigeria, both from the northeast and the northwest, the banditry and what have you, if you go through history, you will see that these are evolving out of the clashes about how much resources, natural resources, are controlled between the farmers and the herdsmen, between the Boko Haram around the Lake Chad Basin after it shrank down to 30%. Lake Chad Basin shrunk down to 30%, and then you can imagine the kind of economic and ecological displacement it has created around that. And it is those ecological displacement and disruptions that created banditry and made it to thrive. And same thing is happening in the northwest. And then we are seeing the same kind of a thing evolving all over the place. Now, if this is the biggest threat that Nigeria is confronted with, and I think I always say this, Nigeria is going to face the biggest threats of climate change effect in Africa. Reason being that it has a population that is almost 20 to 30% of the total population in Africa. I mean, you can imagine what it will take. The devastations of global warming and climate change will definitely disrupt the entire food chain and food supply in the world. And when Nigeria is going to face the biggest of this challenge, I have not seen, committees are being set up here and there, because it's the easiest thing, because it only takes a pen and paper to sign a document, to set up committee or to select people to work in a committee. But where it will take like $50 billion to build additional water reservoirs across the Niger and Benue, across the Niger and the Benue basins. I mean, building additional reservoirs of water that can take Nigeria 30 years. Nobody does that, because that one, politicians don't find that easily expedient to do. You understand me? The floodings we see in the Niger and Benue Delta is because we don't have reservoirs built to actually keep this water for national utilization, because the water that you see running in the rivers is rainwater. Now 90% of total rainwater that God usually lets in this country actually dissipates into the Atlantic Ocean. And nobody seems to see something like that as important. We begin to see, like, these are the kind of things I call fundamentals. You know, when you now begin to do those things that will ensure your future stability and growth. These are existential threats to Nigeria. What I mean by existential threats are threats to the existence of Nigeria.
Very, very intense conversation right there with Rabiu Hassan, who is an economic analyst, speaking to measures that we have seen so far by the federal government towards nipping inflation in the bud, and of course suggestions that Nigeria should pay close attention to. Thank you again for all the insight you've reeled out on today's edition of Business Daily.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Have a nice day.
Well, join the conversation on social media and let us hear your thoughts. What are your thoughts on the topic of discuss today? My name is Chiamaka Enendu. Thank you for watching and have a good day.